Hello again, you might remember me from the first MOOC of this course, the introduction. So just to remind you, I'm Robert, one of the vice presidents at ECYC and one of the trainers for the upcoming training in CBU and one of the trainers for this MOOC. So this module is the module on counter-narratives and alternative narratives as a response to radicalization as a youth work response. So this is going to be a very introductory MOOC because it's such a broad topic, so I'll be directing you to some further resources for reading, and there's a lot of great publications out there, and this MOOC episode will be based off of one of the Council of Europe publications on this called WeCan, their approach to counter-narratives and alternative narratives as a response to hate speech. So this is a youth work response. So first, what is a narrative? Well, the world is confusing and humans interpret the world, interpret the streams of information we see in many different narratives. There's many multi-causal, complex things happening in the world, so we impose a story structure onto the top of these multi-causal elements that we see all around us, and these stories help us make sense of the world. So this is a way to understand events and to form a coherent story or narrative to explain events we see around us. So narratives really are at the foundation of our cognitive procedures, and it's an explanatory framework for how we interact with the world. Yeah, so it's popular in sociology, psychology, law, social sciences, it's in literature, language, linguistics. Narratives really, it crosses many different schools of thought. And narrative as a word stems from Romanian, Latin, Spanish, and English. It's really, as a word, its etymology comes from all the way across Europe. And yes, it's interchangeable with the word story, so perhaps understanding it as a story is another way to understand what a narrative is. It's a story that we place on a series of events or information to contextualize it and understand it. So we create people and roles to understand individuals. So narratives will combine real and fictional elements so that they resonate as a plausible, interesting, and convincing narrative. So, for example, in storybooks, it's typical to have this narrative of a prince and a princess as main characters. The princess is kidnapped and the prince rescues her, and they marry and live happily ever after. So within that story, we see there are multiple narratives. The monarchical structure of society with a prince and princess ruling over a kingdom, and also the gender narrative of a princess and a prince, with the princess, the female gender, being rescued by the male gender. So that's a very basic narrative, a fairy tale style narrative. But you can see that it's not inherently dangerous, that it's fine to have a narrative in which different classes or groups or individuals are acting in different ways. The issue comes when these smaller narratives start to become the only narrative, become the dominant narrative, and when other narratives aren't allowed to come into play, and when people are viewed through the lens of this narrative rather than a more nuanced view of an individual or a group or a set in society. So, for example, that story of a prince and a princess relates to the bigger stories or narratives of gender and power relations in society. So a story of a princess presented as a weak and helpless individual, saved by a prince who's portrayed as a strong and wise individual, reinforces this narrative for unequal gender relations and strengthens a certain social expectation of gender roles. And this isn't always the case. Other stories present female characters as strong and they relate to a prince in a different way. In recent times, you can really see movie studios are capitalizing on this desire to see these roles and these narratives switched. So we often see strong female characters in popular media and in cinema, which is allowing these narratives to shift. And at the same time, narrative is a way to play with audiences and cinemas. It's a storytelling tool. Let me just so that narrative relating to gender. Yes, I've talked about this. The monarchical aspect of the narrative and the gender aspect of that narrative between the prince and the princess. So what is the danger of narratives in context of radicalization? So like I said before, narratives aren't inherently wrong or immoral or dangerous. Narratives, as a fact, are the way in which we interpret many things around us. And in theory, we exist in this marketplace of narratives where we see all these streams of narratives around us, and we pick and choose, thanks to the way our upbringing, where we exist, the narratives that we see on a daily basis, and we form our reality and our perspective of reality depending on the narratives we see. So there is this marketplace of narratives, and in theory, if human beings are rational and empathetic, we form narratives which parallel that and reflect that. But the problem arises when all these small narratives and stories tell the same big story, and it's presented as the only narrative. For example, in many contexts, unmarried women or same-sex couples suffer discrimination as they don't conform to the dominant understanding of how gender roles and relations should be. When one narrative is presented as the only right or normal one, denying alternatives, or in extreme cases, inciting violence against anyone who questions it, well, we see the fundamentals of a pluralistic and diverse society are at stake. It's really threatening the freedom of thought, religion, and belief, and so on. So the problem becomes more serious in the case of violent and extreme narratives, including hate speech. So you can see narratives really are at the heart of radicalization. It's when a single narrative takes a hold of someone's perspective and shapes other narratives and prevents smaller narratives from nuancing an opinion, and an extremist narrative dominates someone's perspective on an issue or a group of people or an idea. So the idea is to allow a pluralistic and diverse society to have multiple narratives coming from multiple directions, and allow people to critically analyze them and form and engage with narratives which aren't dangerous, violent, or extreme. So what is a counter-narrative, the title of this session? Well, a counter and alternative narrative doesn't exist in isolation. It's a direct response to a narrative. So you see a narrative and you say, that might not be healthy for society, that might not be healthy for a group of individuals. How can we combat that narrative? So let's see a narrative in which same-sex relations is abhorrent, or in which heterosexual couples are the norm and the dominant, and anything exceptional to that is dangerous or wrong. That's a narrative which really kind of flies in the face of openness and respect for difference and freedom and equality. So you could create a counter or alternative narrative to enter the marketplace of ideas and marketplace of narratives, to combat that narrative and to directly contradict this idea of what is the norm and allow a more pluralistic society to develop. So that's really where youth work comes into this, that youth workers, youth clubs and organizations can engage with young people, can engage with communities to introduce new narratives, to shape narratives, to allow young people to critically engage with narratives that they're seeing, to understand what is a narrative, to recognize what they're seeing as a narrative, that when they're engaging with their community, they're engaging with narratives, and to step back and question, is this presupposition, this idea of what is normal and dominant, is that something that is necessary, or is that just something that we accept? And a counter-narrative can introduce alternative ideas into society. Yes, so the term counter-narrative is often used in short, especially within work against violent extremism and terrorism. And it emphasizes the need to deconstruct and weaken violent narratives so that they may seem attractive, especially to young people. The use of the term alternative narrative stresses the importance of putting forward different accounts and emphasizes positive alternatives that are not just the negative image of narratives that they seek to counter, and do not reinforce or accredit them by focusing on them. The division between the two terms, between counter-narrative and alternative narrative, is often blurred in practice, and they can really be used synonymously. It's based on this idea of one is opposing and denouncing and deconstructing, and the other one is proposing, developing, and disseminating a separate narrative. So that's that's a pedantic key point. So counter-narratives and alternative narratives aim to reach various target audiences depending on the context. Counter-narratives aim to reach those who already sympathise with extremist views and prevent their further involvement, and also those who already hold extremist views, supporting individuals to change their view and behaviour. So it's a preventative measure, and it's also a responsive measure. So you can, within your youth service, within your youth centre or organisation, you can engage with the community and see some narratives that haven't gripped a hold of the community yet, and place out counter and alternative narratives to combat that. You can also work directly with people who have been radicalised. I think during the Prevent programme in the UK, for all of its flaws, one of their methods was to take young people who've been radicalised into the neo-Nazi community and go to Holocaust memorial, and to humanise and realise the humanity of the situation, to place introduce fundamentally the narrative that these people, that this individual was being taught to hate, the narrative that those people were human, were individuals much like him. And this was an effective narrative to help change this person's perspective. I think there's a very interesting podcast on that, on the Analysis podcast by the BBC, called Prevent. Alternative narratives strengthen positive, inclusive and constructive ideas and aim to reach the whole population, including the producers of hate speech and negative narratives, and allow the whole of society to become acquainted with a new narrative altogether. And different responses are needed for different groups. So, in terms of civic engagement, often the roots of exclusion in society are to be found in institutional discrimination and unequal access to rights, or lack of human rights legislation enforcement. Citizens, activists and movements can influence the political landscape by actively participating in their local, national and international spaces. And this can be done, for example, by advocating for new legislation which either aims at equalising minorities and majorities' rights, or at strengthening anti-violation rules and focusing on targeting of social policies. So in terms of civic discourse and civic engagement, really any political movement or any civic movement is a narrative that you are pushing into the political arena and civic discourse. So it's very interesting to approach policy from the perspective of narratives, and saying that when you see a narrative that you disagree with or you think is dangerous to a community or a set of people, that has a direct influence on policy. That these ideas that float around, they even if they don't directly harm individuals to begin with as an idea, these ideas are influencing the political landscape at a local, national and international level. And it's the responsibility of youth work and civil society to engage with policymakers and young people and all actors in civil society and society to recognise narratives and to recognise the impact that they have on the political landscape. So in terms of where I can direct you to learn some more about narratives, well, number one, the training course next month in Sibiu. If any of you watching are going to this training course, we're creating a publication to disseminate at that training course, and that will be published after the training course, just an alphabetization of the youth work response to radicalization, as well as a lexicon of very common questions and vocabulary. There's also the Radicalization Awareness Network. They have publications in terms of counter-narratives. The Council of Europe, for its No Hate Speech campaign, created the We Can manual. That's available on the Council of Europe website. And also the British Council has a good publication on youth work and radicalization. So that's another very interesting manual to look at for information on counter-narratives. So so that's directions to publications. And the next MOOC will be on a civic youth work response to counter-narrative, to radicalization. So it really follows on from this narrative and policy shaping direction to ask, how do we respond to radicalization by getting young people civically engaged in their communities? So thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, email ECYC, comment on the MOOC, and we have 4 trainers. We'll try and engage with your questions, and I hope to see a few of you next month in Sibiu. So thank you.